They were taken to the Tower of London under royal authority. They disappeared. No investigation followed. 2 years later, Henry Tudor killed the last king. 1483, England removed 2 heirs to the throne without issuing a single death certificate. They were taken to the Tower of London under royal authority. They disappeared. No investigation followed. 2 years later, Henry Tudor killed the last king, took the crown, and married the missing prince's sister. That marriage did 3 things immediately. It made the murders unprovable, it turned civil war into treason, and it reclassified conquest as lawful rule. So this isn't a story about romance. It's about how the Tudor state used one woman to legally close a crime scene. The evidence isn't poetic. It's in dates, custody records, and coronation delays. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The first thing to understand is that none of this was chaotic. It was procedural. On April the 9th, 1483, King Edward IV died suddenly. The crown passed, on paper, to his 12-year-old son, Edward Fee. The law was clear. The boy would be crowned. What changed was custody. Within weeks, Edward V was intercepted on the road and placed into the Tower of London by his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The official explanation was protection. The Tower, after all, was still legally a royal residence. Then the second boy arrived. Richard, Duke of York, Edward's younger brother, was transferred into the Tower soon after. No warrants survive, no charges were filed, but custody changed hands. And in late medieval politics, custody was everything. Who held the body controlled the outcome. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, understood the danger immediately. She fled with her daughters into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, invoking church law to block further seizures. Sanctuary was not safety. It was a holding pattern, a pause, and pauses in power struggles are temporary. Within months, Parliament declared Edward IV's marriage invalid. That single legal maneuver retroactively bastardized his children. Edward V was no longer king. His brother was no longer an heir. The princes were now legally unnecessary. After that, the record goes quiet. No trials, no executions, no funerals. The boys were simply absent. England lived with that absence for 2 years. Long enough for it to become normal. Long enough for people to learn which questions were dangerous. Then, in August 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army. His claim to the throne was weak. Thin blood, distant lines, little precedent. But claims matter less than outcomes. At Bosworth Field, Henry killed Richard III and took the crown by force. That victory created a problem. Conquest is unstable. It invites resistance. So Henry did what every successful regime does after violence. He legalized it. He married Elizabeth of York, not before, after. First, he crowned himself. Then he married the evidence. By wedding the sister of the vanished princes, Henry didn't solve the mystery. He rendered it irrelevant. Any investigation would now implicate the legitimacy of his own reign. Any rebellion could be reframed as treason against a unified crown. York and Lancaster were no longer factions. They were a brand. Elizabeth of York was not a queen at this moment. She was a seal, a signature, a human document used, to certify that England would not ask what happened in the Tower. In the next part, we'll watch how that certification was enforced, not with swords, but with calendars, ceremonies, and silence. If you want to understand how the princes vanished without a trial, you have to stop thinking about murder and start thinking about custody. Late medieval England did not need warrants to destroy a life. It needed possession. Whoever controlled a body controlled the story that body could tell, and the future it could inherit. When Edward IV died in April 1483, the system did not collapse. It snapped into procedure. The council moved fast, not to crown Edward V, but to secure him. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named Lord Protector. That title mattered. It gave him lawful authority over the king's person. From that moment on, every movement of Edward V could be framed as administrative necessity. The interception happened on the road to London. Edward IV was separated from his maternal relatives and escorted to the Tower of London. The language was careful. He was not arrested. He was lodged. The Tower, officially, was still a royal residence before coronation. The law allowed it. That detail would later smother outrage. Then came the younger brother. Elizabeth Woodville knew exactly what was happening. She did not run to the countryside or raise troops. She ran to Westminster Abbey and claimed sanctuary. Sanctuary was church law's emergency brake, a space where royal officers could not legally seize bodies. It was not rebellion. It was compliance by another rulebook. Inside Westminster, Elizabeth Woodville gathered her daughters and her youngest son, Richard, Duke of York. For weeks, the state stalled. Negotiations followed. Promises were made. The boy would be safe. He would join his brother. He would be treated as a prince. Eventually, Elizabeth surrendered him. This is where power tightens. Once both boys were inside the Tower, the crisis was no longer about violence. It was about classification. The next move was legal, not physical. In June 1483, Parliament advanced a claim that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The argument rested on a pre-contract, an alleged earlier promise of marriage that rendered the later union unlawful. Whether the claim was true mattered less than whether it could be ratified. It was. With a single statute, later known as Titulus Regius, Edward IV's children were declared illegitimate. Edward IV ceased to be king. His brother ceased to be an heir. In one vote, two boys lost their political existence. This is the point most stories rush past. But it's the key. Once the princes were legally unnecessary, the system no longer required an explanation for them. The law did not need their deaths. It only needed their irrelevance. After that, there was nothing to investigate. No charges meant no trials. No trials meant no verdicts. No verdicts meant no records. And without records, there is no crime scene. Richard III was crowned in July 1483. The boys were last seen that summer. By autumn, they were gone from public view. Foreign ambassadors whispered, Londoners speculated. But the state did not respond, because the state had already closed the file. Silence was not a failure of governance. It was the outcome. Then something even more effective happened. Time. England did not erupt. There was no mass uprising to demand answers. Instead, people adjusted. They learned which loyalties were now dangerous. which names could not be spoken loudly. The absence of the princes became background noise, a rumor without leverage. This is how unresolved violence becomes stable. 2 years later, Henry Tudor arrived to exploit that stability. His claim to the throne was thin. He was not York. He was not crowned by lineage. He was crowned by outcome. And outcomes need insulation. At Bosworth Field in August 1485, Richard III was killed. Henry took the crown by conquest, a legitimate method, but a volatile one. Conquest invites reversal. Anyone can try again. So Henry immediately began converting force into permanence. He did not reopen the Tower question. He did not promise justice. He did not exhume bodies or commission inquiries. Doing so would destabilize the very framework that allowed him to rule. Instead, he made a surgical choice. He married Elizabeth of York. This was not reconciliation. It was containment. By wedding her, Henry bound his reign to the unresolved disappearance of her brothers. Any attempt to investigate their fate would now threaten the legitimacy of the new dynasty itself. The mystery became politically radioactive. And then, Henry waited. He delayed Elizabeth's coronation. Not days, not weeks, nearly 2 years. That delay was not personal. It was strategic. He needed England to internalize one idea first, that he was king before he was husband, that his authority flowed from victory, not from York blood. Only once that hierarchy was clear did he allow Elizabeth to be crowned queen. By then, the Tower had gone quiet. The sanctuary was empty. The legal reclassification was complete. The crime scene had been sealed, not with guards, but with marriage, statutes, and time. In the next part, we'll examine what Elizabeth of York became after that sealing, how the state managed her visibility, her silence, and her body once she was no longer evidence, but infrastructure. Continue. Once the crime scene was sealed, Elizabeth of York did not disappear. She was repurposed. This is the mistake most histories make. They assume that after marriage, Elizabeth became safe. That legitimacy protected her. In reality, legitimacy consumed her. The Tudor state did not need Elizabeth to speak. It needed her to function. Henry VII understood something fundamental. Unresolved violence does not disappear on its own. It has to be managed. And management requires symbols that look alive, stable, and non-threatening. Elizabeth was perfect for this role. She was York blood without York ambition. She was continuity without challenge. So the state redesigned her position carefully. Elizabeth was married in January 1486. The ceremony was public, formal, and politically loud. But what followed was deliberate quiet. She was not crowned queen until November 1487, nearly 2 years later. This was not neglect. It was sequencing. Henry needed England to learn a lesson before Elizabeth received a crown, that she did not grant him power, that she did not precede him, that she followed. In Tudor optics, order mattered more than affection. Elizabeth's delayed coronation taught the court and the country that York blood had been absorbed, not elevated. She was no longer a claimant. She was confirmation. During this period, Elizabeth did not intervene in politics. There are no manifestos, no speeches, no public demands for answers about her brothers. That silence has often been read as passivity. It wasn't. It was enforced usefulness. Elizabeth's role was now biological and ceremonial. She produced heirs. She appeared at court. She embodied unity. Her presence told England that the question of the princes was closed, not because it was answered, but because it no longer mattered. This is how states neutralize inconvenient truths, not by denying them, but by surrounding them with stability. The births came quickly. Arthur in 1486, Margaret in 1489, Henry in 1491, Mary in 1496. 7 pregnancies in total. Only 4 children survived infancy. Each birth was a public event. Each survival was celebrated. Each death was quietly absorbed. The math was brutal and widely understood. Dynasties required redundancy. Children were not just loved, they were counted. Every successful birth reduced the relevance of the past. Every surviving heir made the Tower question less dangerous. Elizabeth's body became a form of policy, and Henry watched closely. Henry VII has a reputation for emotional distance, and it is earned. He did not rule through charisma. He ruled through control of finances, of nobles, of ceremony. Elizabeth fit perfectly into that system. She was visible, but contained, revered, but politically inert. Court records show Henry lavished gifts on her later: jewels, clothing, entertainments. This is often framed as romance. It wasn't. It was maintenance. A queen who looks cherished reassures the public that the state is healthy. Even leisure was strategic. Elizabeth hosted feasts. She danced. She sponsored music. She appeared joyful. All of it served a function: to replace memory with spectacle, to overwrite trauma with ritual, to make the Tudor court feel normal enough that nobody needed to ask how it began. But normalization has limits. In 1501, the dynasty reached what it believed was safety. Arthur, the heir, married Catherine of Aragon. Spain recognized the Tudors. Europe accepted the paperwork. The war was officially over. Then the system failed. Arthur fell ill at Ludlow Castle and died in April 1502. The redundancy collapsed. The Tudor future narrowed to one remaining boy, Henry. Suddenly, Elizabeth's past was dangerous again. The state responded the only way it knew how. Elizabeth was pressured, implicitly, relentlessly, to produce another son. She was 36. She had already lost children. But risk was irrelevant. Dynasties do not accept biological limits. In February 1503, Elizabeth gave birth to a daughter, Catherine. The baby died within days. Elizabeth developed a postpartum infection. There were no antibiotics, no second chances. She died on her 37th birthday. The infrastructure broke. Henry VII was devastated, not just emotionally, but structurally. Elizabeth had been the hinge that kept the past from swinging back open. Without her, the unresolved crimes of the 1480s had no living buffer. So Henry did what states always do after losing a stabilizing asset. He retreated. He became more paranoid, more controlling, more isolated. The Tudor regime hardened, and the surviving son, young Henry, absorbed all of it. He grew up in a household where women were solutions until they failed, where legitimacy mattered more than truth, where unresolved violence was not corrected, but buried under ceremony. Elizabeth of York did not live to see what that education produced, but her function made it possible. In the next part, We will follow what happened when the infrastructure she embodied was transferred to her children, when legitimacy, once manufactured through marriage, had to be enforced through fear. Elizabeth of York's death didn't reopen the crime scene. It made it more dangerous. Up to that point, the Tudor regime had relied on a living solution. Elizabeth absorbed suspicion. Her presence allowed silence to masquerade as closure. With her gone, the state no longer had a human buffer between the past and the future. What remained were documents, rituals, and a single surviving heir. And that was not enough. Henry VII did not suddenly become cruel after 1503. He became exposed. The protective layer that had insulated his conquest from scrutiny was gone. Without Elizabeth, the unresolved violence of the 1480s no longer had a diplomatic face. It had to be contained another way. So the state shifted tactics. First, Henry turned inward. He tightened financial control, expanded surveillance of nobles, and increased the use of bonds and recognizances, legal instruments that punished disloyalty preemptively. This wasn't tyranny in the theatrical sense. It was bureaucratic pressure, paperwork replacing swords. The lesson of the Tower had been learned. You don't need visible violence if you can make resistance administratively impossible. Second, Henry reclassified memory itself as a threat. The question of the princes had never been answered, but now it was actively discouraged. Talking about the past wasn't illegal, yet, but it became socially and politically hazardous. Favor depended on compliance. Advancement depended on silence. England didn't forget. It learned not to ask. This environment shaped the upbringing of the future Henry VIII. The boy who would later terrorize his court grew up as the only remaining male heir, raised under the shadow of extinction. Arthur was gone. Elizabeth was gone. The dynasty now balanced on one body, and everyone knew it. Henry VII responded by overcorrecting. He controlled his son's movements. He rationed affection. He surrounded the boy with caution instead of confidence. Records of the young prince's daily life are sparse, but the structure is visible. Isolation, discipline, and expectation, without warmth. The child did not grow up learning trust. He grew up learning consequence. This is where the inheritance becomes psychological. Elizabeth of York had represented legitimacy through union. Her son would inherit legitimacy without union, only entitlement. He would not need to merge houses. He would rule alone. But the unresolved crime still mattered. Because the Tudor regime had never taught England that power answers for itself. It had taught England that power reclassifies its own violence until questions dissolve. That lesson did not disappear with Elizabeth. It transferred. When Henry VIII ascended the throne in 1509, he inherited more than a crown. He inherited a method. A system where legality followed desire, not restraint. Where marriage was a tool, not a bond. Where removing a problem did not require explanation, only procedure. Look at the pattern. Henry VIII's marriages were not personal chaos. They were administrative escalation. Each wife was selected to solve a problem. Each was discarded when she failed to function. And when law stood in the way, law was rewritten. This was not innovation. It was repetition. The Tudor state had already demonstrated that marriage could erase inconvenient truths. That classification could replace accountability. That silence could be enforced without bloodshed, until bloodshed became easier again. Anne Boleyn did not fall from favour because Henry was impulsive. She fell because the system had already proven that legitimacy could be manufactured, revised, and revoked without consequence. The scaffold was just a more visible tower. Elizabeth of York never ordered an execution. She never signed a warrant. But her life established the template. She proved that a woman could be turned into a solution, and then disposed of once the solution expired. That knowledge mattered. Henry VIII grew up believing that order came from control, not reconciliation. That problems were solved by removal, not repair. That power did not owe explanations to those beneath it. The state had taught him that lesson long before he wore the crown. This is the hidden cost of unresolved violence. It doesn't stay contained. It mutates. It educates the next generation. It teaches rulers what they can get away with and how quietly. Elizabeth of York's death marked the end of one method of legitimacy. What followed was cruder, louder, bloodier. And by then, England no longer remembered how to stop it. In the next part, we will examine the final transformation, how the Tudor system moved from erasing crimes to performing them publicly, and why the silence learned in the Tower made that shift possible. The Tudor state did not become violent under Henry VIII. It became honest about the violence it had already normalized. Under Henry VII, power erased problems quietly. Bodies vanished. Claims were reclassified. Silence was enforced through paperwork and patience. It was efficient. It left few stains. Henry VIII inherited that system, but he ruled a different moment. England was no longer fragile. The dynasty was established. Foreign courts recognized the crown. Stability no longer depended on subtlety. So the method evolved. What had once been hidden was now displayed. This is the shift that matters. Henry VIII did not invent public executions, forced confessions, or marital trials. What he changed was their function. Violence stopped being something the state needed to conceal. It became something the state used to teach. The Tower of London never stopped being relevant. It just changed roles. Under Henry VII, the Tower was a place of disappearance. Under Henry VIII, it became a place of rehearsal, where accusations were prepared, narratives refined, and outcomes decided before anyone saw a scaffold. The lesson learned from Elizabeth of York was simple. Legitimacy doesn't come from truth. It comes from control of the frame. So Henry VIII widened the frame. When Catherine of Aragon failed to produce a male heir, the problem wasn't infertility, it was classification. She had ceased to function as legitimacy, and the Tudor state already knew how to deal with non-functioning assets. Henry did not ask whether his marriage was just. He asked whether it was useful. The answer was no. So the law changed. The break with Rome was not an explosion of faith. It was an administrative maneuver, an expansion of the same principle that had bastardized the princes decades earlier. If legitimacy could be rewritten once, it could be rewritten again. Marriage was redefined. Succession was reclassified. Loyalty was recalibrated. The machinery did not protest. It recognized the pattern. Anne Boleyn's rise followed the same logic Elizabeth of York had lived under, only accelerated. She was elevated not because she was loved, but because she solved a problem. She promised an heir. She offered a new legal pathway. And when she failed, the state did not retreat into silence this time. It escalated into theatre. Anne was charged publicly. tried publicly, executed publicly. Her body was not hidden. It was displayed as proof that power now answered questions before they were asked. This is where the inheritance becomes unmistakable. The princes in the tower disappeared so that no one would ask. Anne Boleyn died so that no one would dare. Different tactics. Same lesson. Elizabeth of York had lived at the hinge point between these two worlds. Her marriage taught the Tudor state that a woman could carry legitimacy without voice. Her death taught it that silence could survive even without her. Henry VIII took that knowledge and weaponized it. By the time he ruled, England had internalized obedience. Nobles knew how far to lean. Clergy knew when to comply. The public had learned that unresolved violence was not a problem. It was a feature. This is why Henry VIII's reign feels monstrous in retrospect. Not because it was uniquely cruel, but because it was uniquely visible. The violence was no longer being erased, it was being staged. Executions became events, trials became scripts, confessions became choreography. The crowd did not gather to question the state. It gathered to learn what the state could do. And the state learned something in return. Fear was faster than paperwork. Elizabeth of York never saw this version of Tudor power, but she made it possible. Her life demonstrated that legitimacy could be transferred through a woman's body. Her silence demonstrated that unresolved crimes could be sealed permanently. Her death demonstrated that the system did not collapse when its moral center was removed. So Henry VIII ruled without needing a center at all. What began in 1483 as a quiet removal of 2 boys ended as a public education in obedience. The same logic ran through both moments. Power does not explain itself. It classifies, performs, and moves on. The difference was confidence. In the next part, we will trace the final consequence of that confidence. How a state that no longer fears questions begins to demand participation, and how the people who once watched in silence were eventually forced to applaud. By the time Tudor power reached its most confident phase, silence was no longer enough. The state had learned how to erase crimes. It had learned how to perform violence. Now, it needed something more durable: participation. This is the stage most people misunderstand. They imagine obedience as fear alone, subjects shrinking back from a terrifying king. But fear is unstable. It exhausts. It invites resistance. What the Tudors perfected was something colder, a system that trained people to help. The transition began quietly. Under Henry VII, nobles were disciplined through bonds and recognizances, legal agreements that punished future disloyalty in advance. These weren't public spectacles. They were contracts, paper threats. If you failed the crown later, you paid now. It created a culture where survival depended on anticipation, not courage. Henry VIII inherited that legal culture and widened it. He expanded the definition of treason until it no longer described acts, it described attitudes. Words could be treason. Silence could be treason. Loyalty became something you had to demonstrate continuously, or risk being reclassified. This mattered because it changed how violence functioned. Under earlier kings, executions punished enemies. Under Henry VIII, executions instructed everyone else. They told the court what to say. They told Parliament what to vote. They told families what not to remember. And the people learned quickly. Look at how accusations worked. Anne Boleyn was not destroyed by a single charge. She was destroyed by accumulation. Whispers turned into depositions. Depositions turned into testimony. Testimony turned into verdicts that nobody believed, but everyone accepted. The state didn't need belief. It needed cooperation. Judges signed warrants. Courtiers testified. Clergy preached compliance. Crowds gathered. No one needed to be convinced Anne was guilty. They only needed to agree that the process had occurred. This is the crucial inheritance from the Tower. The princes vanished without trials, and England survived. That taught the state it could act without explanation. Decades later, public trials taught the people that explanation itself was optional. By participating, by attending, signing, repeating, the public became part of the mechanism. Violence stopped being something done to society. It became something society helped complete. This is how legitimacy stabilizes after atrocity. Elizabeth of York had been the first test case. Her marriage didn't just end a war, it trained a nation to accept that unanswered questions could be neutralized through ceremony. Once that lesson was internalized, the state no longer needed her body. It needed her precedent. That precedent extended everywhere. Parliament learned to pass acts that retroactively justified outcomes. The Act of Supremacy didn't convince England the king was head of the church. It forced England to behave as if he were. Behavior came first. Belief followed, or didn't matter. Families learned to erase inconvenient ancestors. A disgraced name disappeared from records. A portrait vanished from a wall. Silence was passed down like property. Even memory became regulated. The princes in the Tower were not officially murdered. They were unofficially forgotten. Their absence became a kind of civic discipline, proof that England knew how to live with gaps. By Henry VIII's later years, this discipline was reflexive. When Thomas More was executed, people didn't riot. When monasteries were dissolved, people adapted. When queens were discarded, people adjusted their language. The state no longer needed to close crime scenes. It needed to keep them useful. And usefulness required complicity. This is the hidden cost of legitimacy built on erasure. It does not remain contained within the original crime. It spreads outward, training institutions and individuals to prioritize continuity over conscience. Elizabeth of York had embodied continuity. She had made it possible for England to move forward without reckoning. That movement never stopped. By the time Henry VIII died, England was a country fluent in obedience, not because it was terrorized, but because it had learned the advantages of compliance. Silence protected careers. Participation protected families. Forgetting protected the future. This is why the Tudor legacy cannot be reduced to individual cruelty. The system worked. It worked because people learned what the Tower taught without ever entering it. They learned that legality follows power. That ceremony replaces truth. That unanswered questions fade if enough time passes and enough rituals occur. In the next part, we will confront the final illusion, why Tudor legitimacy still feels stable in textbooks, and how historical storytelling itself became the last institution trained to keep the crime scene closed. By the time the Tudor experiment matured, the state no longer needed silence enforced by fear or paperwork. It had acquired something more reliable: narrative. This is the final layer of legitimacy, the one that survives rulers, regimes, and even archives. Violence can be erased, records can be altered, but once a story hardens, it becomes self-policing. People repeat it because it feels finished. The Tudors understood this instinctively. Henry VII did not commission an investigation into the princes in the Tower. He did not need to. An investigation would keep the question alive. Instead, he allowed ambiguity to calcify. Official records stayed thin. Chroniclers were careful. What was not said began to matter more than what was. That silence wasn't accidental, it was curated. Early Tudor histories reframed the late 15th century as a morality tale. Chaos under weak kings, order restored by strong rule. Richard III became the villain. Henry VII became the healer. Elizabeth of York became the bridge. The structure was clean. It required no footnotes about missing boys. Once this framing took hold, the crime scene disappeared behind genre. This is why later generations argued endlessly about Richard III's guilt, while barely questioning the system that made the question unanswerable in the first place. The debate itself was a success. It localized blame to a single man and insulated the machinery that benefited from the outcome. History became a buffer. Under Henry VIII, that buffer thickened. Court historians, poets, and clerics learned what kind of stories survived. Loyalty was rewarded with patronage. Dissent was labeled sedition. Over time, writers internalized the rules. They didn't need censorship. They needed instinct. This is how legitimacy reproduces itself. Elizabeth of York's role in this process was subtle but decisive. She was consistently portrayed as gentle, silent, and virtuous. The perfect queen, the perfect wife, the perfect mother. Her absence from political conflict was emphasized, not questioned. That portrayal served a function. If Elizabeth had no political voice, then her silence about her brothers became natural, rather than enforced. If she was depicted as serene, then the unresolved violence around her became an unfortunate footnote, not a demand for justice. Her image stabilized the narrative. Even her death was absorbed cleanly. Chroniclers mourned her piety. They praised her fertility. They noted Henry VII's grief. What they did not do was connect the dots, that the woman who had sealed the Tower mystery died because the state demanded one more heir from a body already exhausted. The system did not see contradiction. It saw continuity. And then came the textbooks. Centuries later, Tudor England would be taught as a story of progress. The end of feudal chaos, the rise of centralized authority, the birth of the modern state. Henry VII, the administrator. Henry VIII, the reformer. Elizabeth I, the Golden Age. The missing princes became a curiosity, a mystery, a sidebar. That framing is not neutral. It reflects a historical habit learned early. Treat unresolved violence as background noise if stability followed. If the state survived, the method becomes secondary. If order emerged, the cost is abstracted. This is the final consequence of what began in 1483. The removal of 2 boys without paperwork taught England that legality could be retrofitted. The marriage of their sister taught England that legitimacy could be transferred. The silence that followed taught historians what questions were safe. Over time, even outrage became stylized. Richard III is still debated because debate is harmless. It burns energy without threatening structure. But the deeper issue, the legal choreography that made disappearance survivable, rarely takes center stage. That is not an oversight. It is inheritance. Elizabeth of York did not write the histories that followed her, but her life defined their boundaries. She proved that a woman could be used to end inquiry without ever speaking. She showed that closure does not require answers, only agreement to move on. History moved on, and in doing so, it completed the Tudor project. The crime scene did not vanish because it was solved. It vanished because it was narrated into irrelevance. That is why the Tudors still feel inevitable in popular memory, why their brutality feels contained to individuals rather than systems, why the Tower feels like a Gothic anecdote instead of an administrative instrument. The past didn't disappear. It was edited. In the next part, we will break that edit by returning to the evidence that resisted narrative discipline, dates that don't align, ceremonies that came too late, and bodies that were never required to be found. Narratives can smooth over violence. Paper can legalize it. But some evidence never learns how to behave. It doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse. It just doesn't line up. Start with the dates. Edward IV dies on April the 9th, 1483. Edward V is proclaimed king immediately. His coronation is scheduled. Then it's postponed. Then postponed again. Each delay is justified as procedural. Each delay buys time. Custody changes hands before legitimacy does. This matters because coronations are not symbolic fluff. They are legal thresholds. Once crowned, a king is harder to unmake. Delays create room for reclassification. Now look at the sequence of custody. Edward V is intercepted on the road and placed in the Tower in May. His younger brother joins him weeks later. From that point on, both heirs are inside a controlled environment, guarded, documented, and visible. And then visibility stops. There is no official order removing them. No transfer to another household. No burial record. No confession. The silence begins not with chaos, but with administration. That gap is evidence. Then there's Titulus Regius. Parliament's declaration that Edward IV's marriage was invalid does more than bastardize children. It retroactively rewrites time. It turns lawful births into legal errors. Once passed, the Act does not explain what happens to the boys. It doesn't need to. It renders them irrelevant by statute. The law doesn't say they died. It says they don't count. That's not an absence of evidence. That's a form of it. Next, examine the coronations. Richard III is crowned in July 1483. Henry VII is crowned in October 1485. Elizabeth of York is crowned in November 1487, almost 2 years after her marriage. That delay is often waved away as personality or prudence. It wasn't. Coronations confer visibility and voice. A crowned queen attracts attention. she becomes a focal point for claims. Delaying Elizabeth's coronation minimized the risk that her York blood would revive old questions. The timing is surgical. Then there are the foreign reports. Ambassadors from France, Milan, and Burgundy mention rumors of the prince's deaths within months of their disappearance. These are not modern conspiracy theories. They are contemporary intelligence memos, diplomatic correspondence noting instability. And yet, nothing follows. No English inquiry, no public denial that includes proof, no trial to close the matter. Silence becomes policy not because evidence is lacking, but because evidence exists outside of the channels the state controls. This pattern repeats under Henry VII. After Bosworth, Henry does not repeal Titulus Regius immediately. He waits. He secures his crown. He marries Elizabeth. Then he repeals the statute, restoring her legitimacy without reopening the fate of her brothers. That sequence tells you everything. Legitimacy first, truth later, if at all. Even Elizabeth's own life contains this misalignment. She is visible when unity is needed. She is silent when questions are dangerous. She is crowned when her blood is safe to display. And then she is asked, implicitly, relentlessly, to produce heirs until her body gives out. Her final pregnancy follows Arthur's death with brutal speed. The dynasty loses redundancy. The state responds by demanding risk. Elizabeth complies. She dies. That too is evidence. Not of malice in a personal sense, but of priorities. The Tudor system did not collapse when Elizabeth died. It adjusted. It absorbed the loss. It hardened. What it could not afford was reckoning. So it doubled down on what it knew worked. Procedure over inquiry, ceremony over confession. This is why the princes matter beyond curiosity. They are not important because they were murdered, though they likely were. They are important because their disappearance demonstrated a method that worked so well it didn't need repetition. By the time Henry VIII ruled, the system no longer required missing bodies. It could create legitimacy through performance alone. Trials replaced vanishings. Scaffolds replaced silence. The underlying logic stayed the same, and history, trained by decades of narrative discipline, followed along. When later scholars debate who killed the princes, they often miss the more disturbing point. The system didn't need an answer. It needed closure without truth, and it got it. The evidence that resists this closure doesn't live in sensational claims. It lives in procedural seams, where timelines don't match, where rituals arrive late, where laws do too much work. These are not gaps. They are fingerprints. In the final parts, we will return to Elizabeth of York, not as symbol, not as victim, but as the last person whose existence made this machinery necessary. And we'll ask the question Tudor power spent generations avoiding. What does legitimacy cost when the state decides it no longer needs to explain itself? By the time the Tudor system reached maturity, legitimacy no longer needed to be argued. It had become habitual. This is the most dangerous stage of any political order, the moment when its methods feel natural. When procedures that once required justification are repeated automatically. When people stop noticing the difference between explanation and outcome. Elizabeth of York's life made that transition possible. While she lived, legitimacy required maintenance. Her presence had to be staged carefully. Her silence had to be preserved. Her fertility had to be managed. The state worked around her like engineers around a load-bearing beam. After her death, the beam was gone, but the structure held. That tells you something important. The system no longer depended on her. It had internalized the lesson she embodied. From that point forward, Tudor legitimacy did not need reconciliation. It needed repetition. Henry VII's later years show this clearly. He became more cautious, not less. Bonds multiplied, surveillance expanded, justice grew quieter and more transactional. Nobles weren't executed en masse. They were financially bled until they complied. The goal wasn't fear, it was predictability. Everyone learned the rules. Speak carefully, marry strategically, remember selectively. By the time Henry VIII took the throne, legitimacy was no longer something to be built. It was something to be assumed. This is why Henry VIII could move so quickly when his marriages failed. Catherine of Aragon was queen for over 20 years. She was popular. She was pious. She had been England's princess since youth. But popularity was not legitimacy. Function was. When Catherine stopped functioning, when male heirs failed to appear, the system did not panic. It recognized a familiar problem. A solution was required. And solutions, in Tudor logic, did not require consensus. They required a classification. The break with Rome followed the same pattern established decades earlier. First, redefine the legal framework. Then, perform the outcome. Finally, normalize the result. Marriage invalidated. Succession revised. Opposition redefined as treason. Nothing about this process was chaotic. It was procedural. Parliament passed acts. Clergy swore oaths. Courts adjusted language. The population adapted. Because adaptation had been practiced before. Elizabeth of York had taught England that stability mattered more than answers, that unity could be declared into existence, that unresolved violence could be sealed with ceremony and time. Henry VIII simply removed the patience. Where Henry VII waited years, Henry VIII moved months. Where Henry VII erased quietly, Henry VIII demonstrated publicly. But the underlying confidence, the belief that legality would follow power, came from the same source. This is the inheritance Elizabeth did not choose, but still delivered. Her marriage proved that legitimacy could be transferred without justice. Her silence proved that absence could be normalized. Her death proved that the system would survive the loss of its moral cover. After that, nothing restrained it. By the mid-Tudor period, England no longer needed missing princes to understand how authority worked. It had executions, oaths, and spectacles. But those were refinements, not foundations. The foundation had been laid in 1483, when 2 boys disappeared and the country learned to live with it. That acceptance mattered more than guilt. It meant that future violence did not have to justify itself to the public. It only had to be processed correctly. Trials could be rushed. Evidence could be thin. Outcomes could be decided in advance. As long as the sequence was respected, legitimacy would hold. This is why the Tudor state appears so efficient in hindsight. It didn't just centralize power, it trained people to stop expecting explanations from it, and history followed suit. Elizabeth of York's story is often told as a gentle interlude between wars, a quiet queen, a symbol of reconciliation. But reconciliation implies repair. What happened instead was containment. The past was not healed, it was boxed. That box became England's political inheritance. Every Tudor ruler benefited from it. Every Tudor subject lived inside it. And long after the dynasty ended, the habit remained. Stability first, questions later, if ever. In the final part, we will close the loop we opened at the beginning, not by solving the mystery of the princes in the tower, but by answering the question the Tudor state answered instead. What happens when a nation decides that legitimacy matters more than truth? At the beginning of this story, we asked a specific question. Not who killed the princes in the tower, not how they died, but this: what did the Tudor state do with that disappearance? And why did it work? By part 10, the answer is no longer theoretical. It is visible in outcomes. When two heirs vanished in 1483, England stood at a crossroads. One path led toward reckoning: investigation, accountability, instability. The other led toward continuity, reclassification, silence, absorption. The Tudor state chose continuity, and that choice shaped everything that followed. The disappearance of the princes was never resolved because resolution was never the objective. Resolution produces winners and losers. It reopens wounds. It invites retaliation. The Tudors wanted something else, a future that did not require revisiting the past. Elizabeth of York was the mechanism that made that future possible. Her marriage did not answer the crime. It superseded it. Once Henry VII married her, the question of the princes ceased to be useful. Any inquiry would destabilize the regime that had just ended decades of war, so the state quietly redefined morality itself. What mattered was not justice, but peace, not truth, but order. This is where legitimacy changes meaning. Legitimacy is often taught as consent, people agreeing to be ruled. But Tudor legitimacy was closer to exhaustion. After 30 years of dynastic conflict, England accepted almost anything that promised permanence. The state recognized that exhaustion and exploited it. Henry VII did not demand belief. He demanded compliance. He did not erase memory. He redirected attention. Taxes were collected. Courts functioned. Roads stayed open. Life continued. That continuity was the proof. Once life continues, violence becomes historical rather than urgent. The princes became a tragedy of another time, even though no time had passed. This is why the Tudor answer endured, because it delivered results. England did not descend into chaos after 1485. Rebellions failed. Nobles adapted. Foreign powers recognized the crown. The system stabilized, not because it was just, but because it was effective. And effectiveness teaches a dangerous lesson, that unanswered crimes can be survivable. Elizabeth of York embodied that lesson perfectly. She lived as living proof that the past could be folded into the present without consequences. She smiled at court while her brothers remained unburied in law. She bore heirs while the tower stayed quiet. Her life normalized the unresolved. By the time she died, the lesson no longer needed reinforcement. It had been internalized by institutions, by families, by history itself. That is why later Tudor violence escalated rather than corrected. Why Henry VIII could execute queens without collapsing the regime. Why legitimacy no longer required reconciliation. The state had already learned it could outlive moral debt. This is the answer the Tudors chose. Not truth, not justice, but function. As long as the kingdom functioned, the cost could be abstracted. As long as order held, the origin could be mythologized. As long as ceremonies continued, bones could stay unnamed. The princes in the Tower matter because they were the test case. Elizabeth of York matters because she made the test pass. Together, they proved that a state can close a crime scene without solving it, and still call itself legitimate. In the final part, we will confront the legacy of that choice, not in Tudor England, but in how we still tell stories about power, stability, and necessary silence. The Tudor experiment did not end in 1603. It ended up working. That is the part modern audiences rarely confront. Not because the Tudors were uniquely cruel, but because their solution to political violence proved transferable, exportable, repeatable. The core Tudor lesson was simple. A state does not need to solve a crime if it can outgrow it. England learned that legitimacy could be manufactured faster than truth, that time, ritual, and continuity could drain outrage more effectively than justice ever could. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't stay in the 15th century. It becomes instinct. Look at how the princes in the Tower are discussed today. They are a mystery, a debate, a historical puzzle, not a scandal. No one asks which institutions benefited from their disappearance. No one demands accountability from the system that rendered them irrelevant. The violence has been reduced to curiosity, something to argue about, not reckon with. That framing is the final success of Tudor power, because it shifts attention away from process and toward personality. Was Richard III guilty? Was Henry VII complicit? Did someone else act alone? These questions feel sharp, but they are safe. They keep blame individual. They protect the mechanism. The Tudor state did not survive because one man was ruthless. It survived because an entire society accepted that unresolved violence could be normalized if enough stability followed. And we still accept that trade. We praise Henry VII as a careful administrator. We teach Henry VIII as a dramatic tyrant. We celebrate Elizabeth I as a golden age. Each label isolates behavior. None of them examine the shared inheritance. A political culture trained to prioritize continuity over accountability. Elizabeth of York sits at the center of that inheritance. She is remembered as gentle, virtuous, unambitious, a peacemaker, a symbol. Those traits are not wrong, but they are incomplete. They erase her function. Elizabeth was the proof of concept. She demonstrated that a woman could be used to bind factions, silence crimes, and legitimize conquest, without ever being asked what she wanted or what she had lost. Her silence is treated as character. In reality, it was requirement. And because her role was successful, it was repeated again and again on other women, in other contexts, under other regimes. Marriage as solution, birth as policy, silence as stability. This is not a Tudor problem. It is a state problem. Whenever governments choose reconciliation without truth, whenever they declare unity while leaving crimes unresolved, they are repeating the same calculation made in 1485. Is justice worth instability? The Tudors answered no. And history, by admiring their success, has largely agreed. That agreement shapes how we tell stories. We admire survival. We excuse brutality as necessary. We frame victims as unfortunate but unavoidable costs of order. The princes in the Tower were the cost. Elizabeth of York was the instrument. Stability was the reward. And because the reward lasted, the method was forgiven. This is why the question we should ask is not, who killed the princes? It is this: why did it stop mattering? In the final part, we will close the loop, not by reopening the crime scene, but by confronting the moral accounting that replaced it, and asking what it says about how we still measure power today. At the beginning of this story, we asked a narrow question on purpose. Not who killed the princes, not where the bodies lie, but how a state made that question unnecessary. By now, the answer should be uncomfortable and precise. The Tudor state did not erase the crime in the Tower by force. It erased it by success. 2 boys disappeared in 1483. The kingdom did not collapse. A man seized the crown in 1485. The wars ended. A woman married him. Stability followed. That sequence taught England something lethal, that truth is optional if order holds. Elizabeth of York was the pivot. She did not choose this role, but her life performed it perfectly. Through her body, the Tudor regime accomplished what swords could not. It converted unresolved violence into a settled past. Her marriage didn't explain the crime. It outdated it. Once that happened, the state no longer owed answers. It owed continuity. This is why the princes were never found. Not because the truth was unknowable, but because it was no longer useful. Investigations destabilize. Accountability divides. The Tudors had just ended 30 years of civil war. They were not going to reopen the wound to satisfy conscience. So, they closed the ledger another way. They declared unity. They produced heirs. They performed legitimacy until it felt real. And it worked. England accepted the bargain. Nobles complied. Institutions adjusted. History softened its language. Over time, the disappearance of 2 children became a footnote to success. That is the real resolution of this story. Not justice, but replacement. Truth was replaced by ceremony. Evidence was replaced by time. Victims were replaced by heirs. Elizabeth of York made that replacement credible. Her silence was not innocence. It was infrastructure. She carried legitimacy long enough for it to detach from its origins. Once detached, it no longer needed her or anyone. This is why Tudor violence escalated rather than corrected. Once a state learns it can survive unresolved crimes, it stops fearing them. Henry VIII didn't invent cruelty. He inherited confidence. Confidence that law would follow power. That ritual would overwrite memory. That history would cooperate. And it did. We still tell Tudor history as a story of consolidation and progress. We still debate personalities instead of systems. We still admire the outcome while minimizing the cost. That is the final Tudor legacy, a political culture that teaches us to ask the wrong questions. Not what happened to the princes, but who benefited. Not why Elizabeth was silent, but why her silence worked. Not whether legitimacy was earned, but whether it held. The princes in the Tower matter because they revealed the price of stability. Elizabeth of York matters because she paid it, without consent, without answers, and without a grave for her brothers. When the ledger closes, the state calls that peace, but the bones never did.